drug trafficking cartels have evolved from the days of Pablo Escobar to a world after the fall of Chapo Guzman, a world where sailors, drivers, pilots, bankers, policemen, military, and politicians, among others, are contractors, and criminal bands are franchises of the main surviving Mexican cartels, controlling the market in the American continent and even the world. One of those contractors was a key ally of our foreign policy. In the eyes of Washington, D.C., Juan Orlando Hernandez was a geopolitical counterweight to the leftist governments predominant in the continent. Yet Hernandez was detained on February 14, 2022, on his residency, and soon after, on April 21st, he was extradited to the United States, and now faces charges of being an accessory of drugs and weapon trafficking. His brother, Juan Antonio Tony Hernandez, was detained in Miami in November 2018 under drug trafficking charges and was condemned to life in prison. Despite being under investigation by the DEA as an accessory of drugs and weapons trafficking, Juan Orlando Hernandez completed 2 presidential terms and received the treatment of a key ally of the US government. To find out more about the former president, we spoke with Raúl Pineda, Honduran political analyst and constitutional lawyer. Raúl Pineda, constitutional lawyer and political analyst, thanks for being with us. During Juan Orlando Hernandez's presidency, what was the perception of him inside Honduras?
Bien, históricamente Honduras era calificado como un país de tránsito.
Historically, Honduras was classified as a transit country, but the drug market is ruled by the same rules of the market economy. And in the face of the risks of arrest or interdiction in Colombia, Panama, Costa Rica, or Nicaragua, a market and production center was thought of in Honduras, much closer to the large consumer. That meant permeating the institutions to work with adequate margins of tranquility, regardless of turning the country into a kind of refuge and recreation center where traffickers had their fleet of vehicles, where Chapo Guzman's mother came to stay, a place called Cayo Sierra, which is where the gang, one of the gangs, had a luxury house. And that was generating a close relationship with the political class, which, given the enormous costs of the campaigns and the country's poverty, depends on contributions of organized crime, which has done so in other countries, since the Samper case in Colombia and many other cases that have not yet been made known. But when the relationship is established, a change arises, and there is a change of direction where President Hernandez decides to change some rules of a game that he did not know and begins to extradite drug kingpins who historically and traditionally, as a private company, handled trafficking. Hernandez began to replace them with institutional trafficking, where military personnel and police were used for protection, with the cover of prosecutors and judges who offered a service that could not be offered by other countries due to our institutional weakness co-opted by drug traffickers. They are practically a kind of fourth estate within a republican model.
We hear about narco-trafficking in all Central America and South America, and we also hear about Honduran cartels of the drug, but we don't hear about the maras. What is the role that the maras has in all of this? Are the maras part of the narco-trafficking as well?
Los traficantes siempre han visto con desprecio.
Traffickers have always been viewed with contempt. The gang members who represent the most marginalized members of society, and those maras, were merely allowed to sell drugs in personal doses.
En el momento en que un pandillero de cualquier mara, por poderosa que sea.
The moment a gang member of any Mara, no matter how powerful it is, intends to enter the big leagues of drug trafficking, at that moment it will die. So, they have allowed drugs to be sold in personal doses in certain areas controlled territorially by pernicious gangs.
Drogas en dosis personales, pero los mareros no han entrado.
But the gang members have not entered, and probably will not enter, into the grand management of drug trafficking, which implies the complicity of the financial, banking, and corporate sectors, which implies the control of political powers, of the state, the management of the media, and the relationship with interest groups with a lot of legitimacy in societies.
La relación con grupos de interés con mucha legitimación en las sociedades.
No, a marero is practically marginal. It doesn't have a leading participation in drug trafficking, which are the big leagues of this type of illegal trade.
Lo que es el tráfico de la droga, que es la grande liga de ese tipo de comercio ilegal.
We know that President Juan Orlando Hernandez was being investigated by the DEA since early in his presidency, yet he kept getting the preferential treatment as a strategic ally of the United States. What do you think of all of this?
El caso de don Juan Orlando Hernández no ha sido estudiado. Don Juan Orlando, sin conocer ese inframundo, quiso transformarlo.
The case of Don Juan Orlando Hernandez has not been studied. Don Juan Orlando, without knowing that underworld, wanted to transform it. For example, he built 6 airports in a country of 9 million inhabitants, and each airport, some of which have recently had 3 plane accidents in 1 year, had the sole function of being a logistical platform for drug trafficking. He always thought of the country as a logistics center, for better and for worse. The DEA has very little credibility in the world of interdiction agencies. After all, the DEA's highest decoration was awarded to Noriega. The head of the Southern Command repeatedly came to Honduras to praise the virtues of Don Juan Orlando Hernandez. That world is very complex. For some years, I worked in the Council to Fight Drug Trafficking, and I spent 3 years in the prosecutor's office handling that matter. And the sociological profile of the trafficker is very particular. When you capture a drug trafficker, you have not finished sitting in an interrogation chair. Why are you bringing me? Why don't you bring so-and-so? Because so-and-so is protected by this politician. So, doing research of that nature is not in any way difficult. The problem is that the dynamics of drug trafficking have changed. Before they collaborated to put their allies in power, today they are the power agent. It is worth saying that the case of Juan Orlando Hernandez is not the only one. Very complex situations will be revealed in the immediate future.
Inmediato, un hijo de don Porfirio Lobo, el presidente que entrega el mando a don Juan Orlando, está condenado en Estados Unidos.
A son of Don Porfirio Lobo, the president who handed over control to Don Juan Orlando, is condemned in the United States because the drug trafficker's approach to a president is through a relative. And that type of thing has to make us think not about the individual, but about the failures of the system and the fact that the drug trafficking problem has not been studied by universities in its impact on health, and its impact on the economy, and its political impact. You look at what's happening in Colombia. The ELN, under a political platform, is dedicated to drug trafficking. So it is not exclusively a police problem. It is a problem that requires a multidisciplinary vision, which those who study this have not yet wanted to do, or it has not been convenient for them to do it.
Efectuar o no ha convenido que lo efectúen.
Meanwhile, the drug business continues to grow. There are billions of dollars that enter the financial stream to be laundered. And this generated great damage to the economy of a country because legitimate companies lose competitiveness. But the banks are doing very well, and at the end of the day, that seems to be what counts.
país porque pierden competitividad las empresas legítimas, pero a los bancos les va muy bien. Y eso al fin y al cabo pareciera que es lo que cuenta.
In the old days, the cartels have to send their men to other countries to do the job, and that was very dangerous for them because the drugs were all the time under their responsibility. However, modern cartels like the Sinaloa cartel are like corporations of crime where they externalize most of the services they get. So in that sense, local criminal bands and politicians and militaries that are on their payroll are but contractors of the cartel. We hear that Tony Hernandez, the former president's brother, who is in jail now in the United States, was the one who was working with the Sinaloa cartel as a local cog of the machine in there in Honduras. Once they were arrested, who filled that void? Did the narco trafficking stop in Honduras altogether, or did it continue?
Mire, el negocio es demasiado grande cuando un abogado de un narco va.
Look, the business is too big. When a drug lawyer goes to a bank to deposit $1 million, they give him the receipt for $750,000. Someone at the bank keeps part of that money. The other problem that occurs in this situation is that the drug trafficker does not see himself as a criminal. He sees himself as an industrialist, as a businessman who sells something that's currently prohibited, but later that can change.
Industrial, como un empresario que vende algo que ahorita es prohibido. Algo parecido a la prohibición con la ley seca.
Something similar to prohibition with dry law. When the consumption of alcohol was legalized, that is, from being criminals, they became businessmen and hosts. Unfortunately, the Latin American political class has become highly contaminated by their personal use of cocaine. Another point of debate is how designer drugs, synthetic drugs, cause, for example, cocaine consumption to decrease, or the enormous environmental problem that arises with the need for large sectors of land for coca crops, which require too much sun. And how the laws of the market are imposing themselves on the historical and traditional fight of authorities against criminals.
Con la necesidad de amplios sectores de terreno para los cultivos de coca que requieren mucho sol.
They, I insist, have to be the object of a study, basically in the profile of the criminal, which has generated a subculture, a music, where young people want to be like drug traffickers, where popular culture and the power of the media became an ally of the drug activity by presenting the drug trafficker as a character who lives in a luxurious mansion surrounded by very beautiful women. We need to analyze the psychological aspect, but no one in the study centers and the think tanks and the universities has wanted to address this issue, and the question is why. In Honduras, drug traffickers have even invested in universities. They have become a parallel power, and this has happened in other countries. They need a base of operation that requires two requirements. One is a poor society, and the second, that the authorities are vulnerable to corruption. What they don't tell people is that the worst corruption is the one that arises from drug trafficking.
Lo que no le dicen a la gente, la peor corrupción que surge es la corrupción que surge del narco.
Emergency powers created to fight an emergency are rarely returned, as once the philosopher said. Yet, in this case, we can think about Juan Carlos Bonilla, a ruthless enforcer, a policeman, a general, that was the enforcer for supposed to be the enforcer for the Juan Hernandez family.
Michel Foucault hizo una aproximación muy interesante respecto al poder. Es decir, no tiene nada que ver con leyes.
Michel Foucault made a very interesting approach to power. And this has nothing to do with laws or people. It has to do with power. Hernandez gave a very clear example of what the use and abuse of power is. But in the case of Bonilla, we must distinguish the media narco. In our country, they mention a series of names, a series of people. Suddenly, a road appeared, taken over by police. They stopped at the vehicles, and you had to say the magic word, which was the name of the trafficker, and they allowed you to pass. The other citizens didn't get to pass. The drug dealer showed his muscles. His control and the authority took economic advantage of that. The man who ran drug trafficking in Honduras was Mr. Cesar Castillam, the brother of the person who was captured with Chapo Guzman. Not even the DEA knew of the existence of this guy. That is to say, within this model, there is a media narco, which is the one that appears in the media and that they denounce, and the one that has files in the prosecutor's office. But the real bosses of this are people who keep a very, very low profile. So under this scheme, very specialized procedures are required. People who are experts in the matter and give sustainability to the interdiction projects. I have my reservations that Mr. Bonilla became very deeply involved in that issue, because the Honduran traffic operates segmentally. That is to say, they, for example, in a luxury hotel, pay for a room for a year so that there is a police officer who serves as a liaison with all the police chiefs. So, it's not that a police chief is going to dare to order a subordinate to do something illegal, because the police in Honduras are very effervescent, diverse. There are very good officers who will report it if they are ordered that way. So you work better with the regional chiefs, with the command chiefs, with the people located in the right places. In this case, the islands or the sectors of the departments of Copan, Colon. And if they require help, the most a police chief can do is appoint a corrupt officer chosen by the drug traffickers. But for a police officer to directly and personally conduct a drug entry operation is very difficult. They can participate in a drug bust through former police officers that they control. But seeing Bonilla as a person of the political weight of the power of Juan Orlando Hernandez is a mistake. Don Juan's problem is that he wanted to transform what had taken years to build. I mean, making the country a logistical support base and charging for each small plane that landed in our country to refuel, that is to fill up with fuel. Then those 6 airports were created whose only function was that instead of the planes landing on a dirt road, it landed on a paved runway and they paid for the impact. Later, they ventured into the different environments of criminal activity of drug trafficking, but his main project was not drug trafficking. He tried to replace narcos with elected military personnel, with police officers, with elected politicians, who will have an entire structure of media, opinion leaders, and organized political groups. Because a political party that was well organized will be unconstitutionally following, without knowing it, the interests of the traffickers, and placing the traffickers or those designated by the traffickers in Congress, in the Supreme Court, and in the prosecutor's office. So, he wanted to do what has not been done in other countries, and that generated enemies among some drug traffickers who had protection, or had their agreements with the United States government, and who began to denounce, to monitor, to inform, to report some clumsy activities that Mr. Hernandez got involved in, which is not an individual case, it is a system problem. Unfortunately, names cannot be given of senior officials who are still in power, but who are involved in this. Of course, today the profile of traditional cartels have been lowered. The media cartels have been replaced by more divided cartels. So instead of 3 groups, today there are 10, but these 10 maintain a level of communication and the awareness that the confrontation between them and the generation of violence harms them. So they're in a very discreet role, but trafficking more than was trafficked before.
Y la conciencia de que la confrontación entre ellos y la generación de violencia los perjudica. Entonces están en un papel muy discreto, pero traficando más de lo que se traficaba antes.